what are the dangers of seeking God's hand but ignoring his face? This is what we're going to consider in this two-part series. So this is part one of seeking God's hand versus seeking God's face. Seeking God's hand versus seeking God's face. Part one. Well, at the beginning, before the fall of man, man did not need to seek God. Actually, God was always looking out for him. But all that ended after his fall. It was now distant from God, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. This was unfortunate. So, and he himself realized that something was wrong. Don't forget, after the fall of man, his life changed drastically. He lost most of his privileges. All the privileges he had taken for granted, he lost them. So his life now became a life of unrelenting toil. According to Genesis 3:17, man became someone who had to toil relentlessly before he could put food on the table. And to worsen the situation, God also cursed the soil. According to Genesis 4, verse 12, which reads, "When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength." So that has to be taken note of. And so the earth environment was becoming very unfriendly. So that was the situation that man found himself. So effectively, the race for survival had begun. So we can actually say that was the beginning of the so-called rat race. So you can say that the rat race began at the beginning, because humans found themselves in a situation whereby they needed to toil for everything they had. So it was the beginning of the rat race. So the word rat race cannot be described as, we can say, maybe it's a modern word, but the idea actually started from the beginning. The rat race where humans had to toil and compete for whatever they had. It was not surprising that humans realized that they needed help, that they needed God's help. So this was why the Bible says that humans started praying in Genesis 4:26. Genesis 4:26. Let's look at it. It says, and so unto Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. So prayer had become necessary because humans realized that they needed help from above. Humans realized that without God, they will be worse off. So don't forget, humans were now in a fallen state, and they now realized that they needed help from God. So humans effectively began or started to enlist the help of God in the rat race, which was now the order of the day. So that was what the life of humans had become. Don't forget, before his fall, he took things for granted. He didn't have to toil before he ate, even though he was walking. But he wasn't walking because he had to eat. No. He was walking in the will of God. So everything needed by him were provided. So surprisingly, despite the situation in which humans found themselves, there were still a few people who had time for God. Even though the majority of humans were given to the rat race, they believed they had no time for God. But there were still one or two people who remembered God, who cared about God, who sought God. And one of these men was Enoch. The Bible tells us about Enoch. Let's look at Genesis 5:24. It says, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. It was surprising that in such a period when most people were obsessed or preoccupied with the rat race, there was a man who remembered to seek God. There was a man who remembered to love God. There was a man who walked with God. And Enoch was that man. The Bible described him glowingly in Genesis 5:24. I read again. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Then shortly after that, we also had a man called Noah. He also remembered God. He wasn't only given to the rat race. He remembered God. Despite the fact that almost everyone else was obsessed with what they could get from their environment, and they were seeking God, just his hand, not his face. Unlike Enoch and Noah, who actually sought God's face, but the majority sought God's hand. That is what they could get from God. Let us look at what the Bible says about Noah. So Genesis 6 verse 9. Genesis 6 verse 9. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. And Noah walked with God. Just like Enoch, there was another man who remembered to seek God, who remembered to seek the face of God, who remembered to do the will of God, who remembered to love God. It was not surprising that the Bible described him as someone who was just. Verse 9 of chapter 6 of Genesis. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. And Noah walked with God. He wasn't walking with God because of only what he could get from God. He wasn't walking with God just to seek the hand of God, but he sought God's face. So that was that. While the majority of humans were seeking God for what they could get from God, it was happening that these gentlemen, Enoch and Noah, sought God. They remembered God. They walked with God, according to what we just read in Genesis chapter 5 and chapter 6. So Enoch and Noah were examples of humans who sought God, while others were seeking the hand of God. The two gentlemen were more interested in seeking the face of God. So it is surprising by today's standards that there could be men who, despite what was going on around them, despite the situation in which the human race found itself, they still remembered God. So the two men sought God while others around them sought the hand of God. Enoch and Noah sought the face of God. That was why the Bible described them as men who walked with God. So, unfortunately, because nobody was seeking God, nobody was seeking the face of God, everybody was interested in what they could get from God. The world of that time had to be destroyed, unfortunately. So, that was how that world ended. So, in part 2 of this teaching, we are going to look at what happened. And we are also going to consider the dangers of seeking God's hand, but refusing to seek his face. Thank you very much, my hearers. God bless you mightily. Thank you.